In this lesson, we're going to go over software testing. And this is the general software testing, as in what every tester should know. Before you go and specialize into, performance tester or accessibility tester or cybersecurity tester, before you do any of those, you got to know all the basics of software testing. Think of it like doctors, before you become a ophthalmologist or a gastroenterologist, all doctors probably have to know what the general practitioner knows, right, before they specialize. So that's what this is. So let's start with functional testing. It's verifying the application works as expected based on requirements. Yes, basically you're testing the app. You have to see that it does what it's supposed to do from a user's perspective without worrying about the code or internal functionality. So it's the most basic test of function of the app. Smoke testing. In smoke testing, you're testing the basic functions before the critical testing begins. For example, you're checking that a car starts before you check the engine. That's it has to work properly and be stable enough before you do any further testing. So that's smoke testing. You do the very basics. Be like, okay, the website launches. We're good to do some functional testing. End-to-end testing. You test end to finish. This is basically testing the flow of an application from start to finish, and you ensure all the components work together. Let's say you're doing e-commerce, so you start searching the product, you add it to the cart, and then you check out, you go through the whole checkout process, and you pay and you get your confirmation. That would be end-to-end testing. You follow the whole flow from start to finish. Regression testing. You have to ensure that the new changes, whether it's bug fixes, an update of a new feature, new code that they introduced, you have to make sure that didn't break any existing functionality. So this prevents new bugs from being introduced, and it's usually done after any new features added or code gets updated before any major releases. Responsive testing. This works on a variety. You have to make sure that it works on a variety of screen sizes and devices. So the goal here is to ensure that the design, like the layout of the page, adapts across phones, tablets, and computers. And this is kind of easy to do. You can use the developer tools on Chrome, or you can use something that's called XPath on Apple that simulates different devices. Cross-browser testing. You make sure the website works across all different browsers and different versions. So by versions, I don't mean versions of your site or the app that you're making. I mean versions of the browser. Believe it or not, back in the day, we had a lot of websites that would work perfectly on IE 10 and 11, but they would work horribly on IE 8. And nobody uses Internet Explorer 8 anymore, but back in the day when those versions were still part of the requirements, it was a nightmare for developers to make it work on browsers that old. So make sure you read the requirements before you start writing defects about it doesn't work on, Firefox 20.0 or whatever. Now they have way more updated versions, and a lot of companies they're not supporting old versions anymore. Like they'll really say, we do not support IE 8 or old Firefox. So just make sure you're up to date with the requirements so you don't write defects that aren't really defects. Sanity testing. So this check fixes or code change. You only checking the fix. It's a quick focus test after a bug fix or small code change, and it ensures that the specific functionality is working correctly. I remember when I wasn't familiar with this term back in the day, I had my bosses be like, can you do a quick sanity test on the checkout? And I figured out, okay, so that means they just want to check that and nothing else. Exploratory testing, it's hands-on testing approach, which means there's no test cases, there's nothing predefined. You rely on your intuition, your creativity, your experience, It's usually done when there's limited documentation in the early development stages. When you first get hired, your boss will be like, okay, do some exploratory testing so you get familiar with the site before you do any type of like real testing. Black box testing. A lot of these terms, by the way, are very like synonyms of each other. Black box testing is like functional testing. You catch functional bugs, make sure the input and the output work. So you're testing without knowing the internal code, and you kind of focus on the user interactions. Like you catch functional bugs, and think of it as if you're doing black box testing on a vending machine. All you're testing is that you put the money in, the item falls out, and you get your change back. That's it, right? You don't care how it works, how the springy thing works and pushes the thing out. None of that. It's input and output testing. API testing, that is application programming interface. And you're verifying that the different software systems communicate with each other. You're ensuring the data accuracy, you're checking the performance load, you're validating security, as in you confirm the API is secure from vulnerabilities. It improves the system integration. You have to verify the API works with other systems. And we'll go over this more when we go into the performance testing. Integration testing, communication between modules. Yep. Basically, this is done after unit testing, which is unit testing is testing the individual components, and that's usually done by the developers. But this is done before the system testing, which we'll go over next, to ensure the application works as a whole. Like what's tested is the communication between modules, data integrity, and error handling, making sure all the errors work correctly. And then we got system testing, where the entire application is tested as a whole. This is a high-level testing phase that checks the overall functionality. You do this testing in a complete environment, meaning all the modules, components, and external interfaces are there. Back when I was doing video games, we had to do system testing once the whole game was basically complete and you had to play with the actual controllers. Because believe it or not, the beginning phases, you wouldn't even use the controllers yet. So you kind of use that towards the end, towards system testing. This one's a little complex because there's like types of system testing. So there's functional, non-functional, security, performance, UI, like user interface, compatibility, recovery. Can the system recover from a failure? All that, like, does it freeze? What happens if the system freezes? Does it recover? Okay. That's all part of system testing. So, yeah, system testing is definitely one of the ones that's part of manual and automation testing. And user acceptance testing, UAT. So in UAT, the end users verify functionality and requirements. So this is the final phase of software testing. It's where the end users and the stakeholders verify that the software meets their requirements and it works as expected. It's done before production release or before it goes live. I was part of a user testing once, and it's actually nerve-wracking because you have all these testers either from another company or the clients, the ones that are paying you to make the website. And that's when they test it, and they will usually follow all the test cases that your team has written, and then they try and find something. The reason I say it's nerve-wracking is because they often find defects that like you as a tester found, but then your company or the developer said, no, that's not a defect, we don't want to fix it. And then the UAT users end up finding the same thing. So it kind of makes you look bad because, they're thinking, oh, how did they miss this? But most of the time it wasn't missed. The company or the developers decided that it wasn't a defect. But just something to keep in mind. Don't take it personally when the UAT testers find a bunch of defects that you already found but didn't get fixed. Okay, and last but not least, the reason I put worth mentioning is because they don't really use these terms a whole lot anymore. Like, it's very hard to find jobs that'll say, I need someone that does alpha testing. Usually they call it A/B testing. You'll see that term a lot more. Um, and then white box testing, it's kind of what encompasses unit testing and integration all together. So if you see a job that says we want a tester that does white box testing, they want you to do unit testing and security testing. But the reason it's not very common is because developers usually do that, not testers. Anyway, let's go through these. Okay, so we got alpha testing. So that is pre-release testing before customers. Really, it's done by the testers or the developers, and it's done, before the customers try it, similar to system testing. There's a lot of synonyms in testing, a lot of things that are kind of repetitive. Beta testing is real world testing where the users try software before a release. It's very similar to UAT in that case. You have a group of users checking out the software before it goes out live. So very similar to UAT. A/B testing, aka split testing, is when they find a selected group of users to try the software before full release, but to try two versions of it. And then they determine which one performs better based on the real user interaction. So two versions, A or B. That's split testing. Unit testing, so this is done at code level by the developers. We testers, we get to check this during integration testing. Usually they use unit, PyTest, NUnit, or Mocha for doing this. So white box testing, the tester examines the internal structure, code, and logic. A type of white box testing is unit testing and security testing because you're identifying vulnerabilities in the code. And also integration testing because you're checking the interaction between modules. So white box testing uses a lot of unit testing, security testing, and integration testing all in one. So think of all those types of tests if somebody asks you to do white box testing. But those are usually done by developers or SDETs, software developer engineering and tests, which an SDET is basically a developer that turned into a tester or a tester that also knows how to develop, how to code. So they usually do that type of testing. Gray box basically combines both black box testing and white box testing. The tester has partial knowledge of the internal structure but still tests it from a user's perspective. Alright, and last but not least, here is your path to software testing. You gotta get familiar with all the bulleted points, which we just went over. You have to learn, obviously, functionality testing, learn to perform all the types of testing for functionality, which is everything in the bullets. Learn the basics of software testing, which we went over in the first lecture. The types of testing, you will know all those by the time we're done with the course. SDLC, one is software development lifecycle, which encompasses the whole development lifecycle, and STLC is software testing lifecycle, which just concentrates on the testing part of it. Responsive testing, as we went over, I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna teach you what you need to learn, right? But not how to do all those types of testing. So for responsive testing, you should learn how to use the browser DevTools. And if you are on a Mac, there is a thing called XPath Simulator, which is a handy tool that can simulate all the different types of mobile devices. Actually, let me show you real quick how to, because this is a quick, easy to learn thing. This is how you do the browser DevTools. Basically, you go to your website, you right click, let me see if I can right click with my Mac, and then you click inspect or inspect element, depending on your browser. And then you see here the dimensions responsive. or you select what type of phone you want. There's, let's say, iPad mini, and then bam, it does iPad mini. So this is responsive testing, and this is how you would use your actual browser tools. Oh, you select Galaxy. Now, a lot of people don't recommend this because this is very basic responsive testing. Um, the this is what they call an emulator. Now, the simulators are much better. They're more accurate. A lot of times, this type of simulator doesn't work very good, but it's good for basics. So let's go back to our trail here. Okay, so you're familiar with the levels of testing now. There's unit done by developers, and then we come in at integration and system testing, UAT. Those are the levels of testing from start to end. Effective communication, you got to be good at writing test cases, test plans, positive versus negative scenarios, you know what not to do. Those are also a part of test plans. Executing them and reporting defects. So you have to be very good at writing. Methodologies, we went over this: Agile, Scrum, Kanban, Waterfall. You're familiar with all those. Tools used, well, project management tools and defect tracking tools like Jira, Bugzilla, Testro, Mantis. You can watch YouTube videos on how to use all of those, with the most common one being Jira. Cross-browser testing, for that, which is to test on different browsers and different versions of browsers. Browser Stack is a good one. Oh, sorry, I misspelled it. It's Browser Stack with an R there. Sauce Labs, Lambda Test, cross-browser testing, one word. Those are all great for cross-browser testing. And then, last but not least, learn some SQL basic queries if you're gonna be testing anything with a database. It's not one of those skills that's mandatory. It's rarely used, but good to know. You know, you don't want to miss out on a job just because you don't know basic SQL. And for API testing, also I think this would be an optional one, because usually people that do API testing do performance testing, which we're gonna go over in our performance testing lecture. But again, always good to know a little bit of API testing. So Postman and SoapUI are some of the most common ones for that.